The deed was folded so many times that the paper had gone soft at the creases, soft the way cloth goes soft when it has been washed more times than anyone bothered to count. Lena Farwell set it on the banker's desk with both hands, the way you set down something fragile and important, and she smoothed the edges flat before she let go. The appraisal sheet was already there turned so she could read it right side up. Harlan Foss had done that much for her. He was not an unkind man. He was a precise one, and precision had a way of looking like unkindness when the numbers came out wrong. No well of record, no pond, no reliable stock water. The words were printed in the clean block type of a government form, and they sat there on the desk between them like something that had already been decided. Lena was 22 years old. She had been inside this bank before plenty of times, but always on errands, always carrying something for someone else, always there and gone before the weight of the place had a chance to settle on her. She had never sat across this particular desk from Harlan Foss before. She had not expected it to feel the way it did, like the room had already made up its mind before she arrived. She looked at the appraisal sheet for a moment. Then she touched the deed with one finger and drew it slightly toward her. The language inside was old. It ran in the style of a man who had learned to write legal description in the century before last, measured in chains and links, and the distance between trees that had long since grown or fallen or turned to soil. Lena had spent 2 years as a file clerk at the county courthouse before her father's health began its long, slow failing. And in those 2 years, she had read documents like this one, the way other women her age might read letters with a practiced eye that found meaning in the arrangement of familiar words. She understood the grammar of it. She understood what it was and was not saying. She found the line she had come here for, and she turned the deed so it faced the banker. Water at the Walnut, she said, and pointed to the middle of the page. Harlan Foss leaned forward on his elbows and read. He had reading glasses on a cord around his neck, and he did not put them on, which told Lena something about how seriously he was taking this. Delbert Yunt was standing near the file cabinet along the wall, holding a folder he had brought in for some other piece of business entirely, and he was the one who answered before the banker could. That tree's been gone longer than you've been alive, he said. I was not saying it to be cruel. Delbert Yunt was the kind of man who stated facts the same way whether the facts were kind or not, and that was the fact as he understood it. The walnut was gone. People in the county knew it the way they knew other things that had been true for longer than anyone living could personally vouch for. They knew it because their fathers had told them, and their fathers had known it for the same reason. There was a man standing near the door who had come in to see about his own business, waiting his turn the way small county men did, and he spoke into the space that followed. A dead tree doesn't water cows, he said. His name was Dale Pickett, and he was 65 years old, and he had farmed the land adjoining the Farwell place on the east side for the past 30 years. He knew the ground in question. He had looked across the fence at it more seasons than he could easily count, and he was not a man who said things he didn't believe. Nobody laughed. Nobody needed to. The three of them had already arrived at the same conclusion without discussion, the way people in a small county sometimes do, through an accumulation of shared knowledge and shared assumption that moves faster than any argument. They were right about the tree. Lena understood that. She was not there to argue about the tree. She was there because she read the language of old deeds differently than the three men in that room, and what she had read had brought her here with the deed in her hand, and 21 days before Harlan Foss's patience with the note on the farm ran out entirely. The balance remaining on the note was $6,800. Her father, James Farwell, had held the note on those terms for the better part of a decade, paying it down slowly out of what the land produced and what he could make on the side. And the terms had been reasonable enough when he had been healthy and working, and the herd had been carrying its weight. But James Farwell had gotten sick in the winter of '84, and the sickness had taken longer to take him than anyone had expected. And in the time it took, the herd had fallen behind on care, and the note had fallen behind on payments. And by the time he died in the early spring of '86, the debt that remained was exactly $6,800, and the farm that was supposed to carry it had been declared by an appraiser who drove out from the county seat, and spent 40 minutes walking the perimeter to be ground that could not support cattle without water. The appraiser was not wrong about the ground. He had measured what was there and described it accurately: 28 acres of rough pasture on the upper slope, 18 of brush and cedar which nobody had cleaned in years, 12 of lower hay field that had produced decently until the equipment needed for it had started aging faster than the money to maintain it, 9 acres of rocky slope on the north face that nobody had ever figured out a use for, 74 acres total, and not a pond, well, or documented spring anywhere in the survey record. What the appraiser had not done was read the deed. He had read the survey. He had read the current record. He had looked at the land the way a man looks at land when he is checking boxes. And the boxes he was checking were the boxes that mattered to a bank in 1986, which were the modern boxes, the documented ones, the ones that showed up in county water records and well permits, and the kind of paper that could be held up in a room and agreed upon by people who had never touched the ground in question. The deed was not that kind of paper. The deed was older than any of those systems. It had been written in a language that predated county water records and well permits and appraisal forms. It had been written by a man who described land the way men described it before iron stakes were common, using trees and stone corners and the features of the ground itself as his markers, and he had included in that description a detail that nobody who had looked at the deed since then had thought to take seriously: water at the Walnut. 3 words folded into the middle of a legal description that ran for most of a page, unremarkable except to someone who had spent 2 years reading documents like it and understood in the particular way that file clerks sometimes understand things that lawyers and bankers overlook, that men writing legal descriptions in the old style did not waste ink. They wrote what was there. If it said water at the Walnut, water had been there for someone, not as decoration, not as poetry, as fact. The walnut was a boundary marker, yes. That was the primary function of the tree in the description, the way living posts served before iron stakes were available. But a deed did not add the word water to a tree unless the tree had meant something beyond the line it marked. Men did not stop to note water unless water was worth noting, and water was worth noting in hill country because hill country in summer was the kind of dry that could take your cattle in less time than it took the county to register a drought. Lena had read the deed for the first time 2 weeks after her father's funeral, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she kept forgetting to drink. She had pulled it from the file box where he kept his important papers, a cardboard box that smelled of cedar and old rubber bands. And she had unfolded it slowly because even then she could feel the fragility of the creases. And she had read it the way she had learned to read documents in the courthouse from the beginning, not skipping anything, not assuming. When she reached the words water at the Walnut, she had read them twice. Then she had set the deed down and looked out the kitchen window at the south pasture where the ridge ran down to the old fence line, and she had stayed there long enough that the coffee went cold. The walnut was gone. She knew that. She had known it her whole life, the same way she knew the kitchen smelled like her mother's bread, even though her mother had been gone for 8 years. Some knowledge lives in you before you know it is there. But she had read enough old deeds to know that the walnut was not the water. The walnut was the sign. Men in the old century marked springs by the trees that grew beside them, not because the trees made the water, but because the trees announced it. A walnut by a spring grew differently than a walnut on dry ground, and men who worked land for a living could read the difference. And when they needed to write a legal description, they wrote what they read. They wrote the tree, and they wrote what the tree meant. And what it meant was already known to anyone who had spent enough time looking at how walnuts grew and where they chose to grow and what grew with them. The water was not in the tree. The water was in the ground where the tree had stood. Lena had 21 days. The banker had given her that with more kindness than the situation required, because Harlan Foss was in fact not an unkind man, only a precise one. And precision required deadlines, the way a fence required posts. Without a documented water source on the property, the note could not be carried on its current terms. The bank would recommend it be called against the herd, which meant 19 cow-calf pairs that her father had spent the better part of a decade building up from 8 animals, and a borrowed bull would be loaded into a truck and hauled to the sale barn in Calvert, and whatever the market gave her that day would go against the note, and whatever was left of the note after that would be a problem for the county to sort out. The herd was the thing she was least willing to lose. She had grown up with those cattle, the way some girls grow up with horses or dogs, knowing them by sight, knowing which ones led and which ones followed, knowing which cows would walk straight to the gate in the morning and which ones needed convincing. Her father had kept records on every animal calving dates and weaning weights and lineage going back 3 and 4 generations, written in his careful hand in the green notebooks he kept on the shelf above the kitchen desk. She had read those notebooks the same way she had read the deed from the beginning, not skipping anything, and she had understood from them that the herd was not just a number on an appraisal sheet. It was the work of a man's life. She was not going to load it into a truck if there was any other way. She left the bank on a Wednesday morning in late June with the deed in her jacket pocket and the appraisal sheet folded and tucked beside it, and she drove the 12 miles back to the farm on the county road with the windows down because the truck's air conditioning had given out 2 summers before, and she had learned to work around it the way you learn to work around most things that broke on a farm when the money wasn't there to fix them. The road ran through country she had looked at her whole life without looking at it, the way you stop seeing the walls of the room you grew up in. Limestone outcroppings along the upper cuts where the road had been carved through the ridge. Second growth cedar coming back along the fence lines where nobody had cleared in a decade. The creek at the bottom of the valley running low and clear the way it ran in June before the real heat set in. A neighbor's hayfield already cut and baled, the round bales sitting in rows like something placed there deliberately. She turned in at the gate of the Farwell place and drove the gravel lane up to the house and sat in the truck for a minute without getting out. The farm looked the same as it always had from the outside. The house needed paint on the east gable. The equipment shed needed one of its roll-up doors, rehung, a job her father had been meaning to get to. The south pasture ran from the back of the yard to the fence line at the bottom, where the old lane used to run before it had grown over in her grandmother's time, and the cattle were scattered across it in the mid-morning heat, moving slowly or standing in the shade of the cedars at the far end. She sat there and looked at them. 19 cow-calf pairs, her father's life's work, standing in a pasture on dry ridge ground that a man from the county seat had declared could not carry cattle without water. She got out of the truck. She went inside and she made a pot of coffee, and she sat down at the kitchen table with the deed and the appraisal sheet and a legal pad she took from the drawer where her father had kept office supplies. She wrote numbers on the legal pad. A new drilled well by the single quote she had gotten would run $6,900 for the hole itself, plus another $2,100 for casing, pump, and wiring, plus $650 for tank and line. Close to $9,650 total, which was a sum the bank was not going to lend against undocumented ground, and which she did not have in any account anywhere. Hauling water was the other option. The going rate that summer was $44 a day. A typical dry stretch ran 60 to 70 days once it set in. 68 days at $44 was $2,992, not counting the fuel and the hours it pulled out of every working day. And that assumed a typical year, which was not guaranteed. She set her pen down and looked at the numbers. Neither one worked, not alone, not without selling down the herd first, and if she sold down the herd first, she was selling the thing. The note was supposed to preserve, which meant she was already losing before she began. She picked up the deed. She read the line again. Water at the Walnut. She thought about what she knew about walnuts, which was not nothing. She had grown up on land where black walnuts were as common as cedars, and she had spent enough time in the woodlots with her father to know that walnuts chose their ground with a preference that other trees did not show in the same way. They liked moisture. They liked the lower edge of a slope where water moved slowly through the soil rather than running off. They grew bigger and lasted longer in the places where the ground held something, and the old trees, the ones that had been standing for 100 years or more, had generally been standing in ground that had given them a reason to. She thought about where the old Walnut had been. She knew the ridge. She knew the farm. She had walked every acre of it in her father's company before she had known how to write her own name. She had a sense of the ground way people do when they have been moving through it since childhood. A kind of physical memory that is not quite the same as knowledge, but is not quite different from it either. The south face of the upper ridge. That was where the old lane had run before it grew over. That was where the deed description put the walnut. She had not paid much attention to that section of the property because there was nothing there to pay attention to, or so she had always thought. Scrub and cedar, old fence posts, a gap in the stone wall where a gate had hung at some point before her time. She picked up her pen and wrote the word walnut in the center of the legal pad and circled it. Then she wrote the number 21 below it. 21 days. She was going to need to be methodical about this. She went to bed that night thinking about deeds and walnuts and the way old language worked. And she woke up before dawn and lay in the dark listening to the mockingbird that had been singing in the cedar outside her window since she was a girl, and she made a decision. The decision was not dramatic. It was the kind of decision that gets made in the 4 o'clock dark when the light is still an hour away and the mind is working in that space between sleep and morning that is often clearer than anything that comes after. She was going to find the walnut. She was going to find it by reading the ground the way the deed described it, starting from the beginning, not skipping anything, not assuming. She was going to do it the way she had learned to read documents at the courthouse, which was the way her father had taught her to read anything worth reading. You start at the first word, and you do not let yourself decide you already know what it says before you have finished reading it. She dressed before it was fully light. She put on the flannel shirt, the red and cream plaid one she had owned since she was 17, washed soft and faded at the collar from years of wearing. Over it, she pulled the canvas jacket that had been her father's tan and caramel brown, too big for her, across the shoulders, the lining worn through at the right elbow from the way he used to rest his arm on the window frame of the truck. She had not been able to make herself get rid of it. She had been wearing it most mornings since March. She found a folded sheet of paper in the kitchen drawer, a blank one, and she copied the relevant portion of the deed description onto it in her own handwriting, large enough to read without squinting. Beginning at the south stone corner, thence north by the marked lane to the black walnut, with water at the walnut, thence west along the ridge. She put the paper in her jacket pocket and went outside. The morning was cool still, with the kind of damp in the air that would burn off by 8 and leave the day hot and still. The cows were moving toward the lower fence the way they moved every morning at this hour, drifting in the loose, unhurried manner of animals who know the day's schedule well enough to follow it without being asked. She watched them for a moment. Then she walked to the south stone corner. She found it where she expected to find it, under a stand of honeysuckle that had grown up over it in the years since anyone had needed to refer to it for anything. The vine had taken the stones and softened their angles and wrapped their tops in green so that from a distance it looked like nothing more than a low mound of vegetation, the kind of mound you find in old fence lines everywhere in this part of the country. She pulled the vine back by hand until the stone showed clean. Limestone slabs stacked without mortar, field stone gathered from the ground nearby. She counted them, and she satisfied herself the same way she would satisfy herself that a case number matched a file before she pulled it from a drawer, that this was the same corner the deed had been written for. The count was right. The compass bearing from the county road was right. This was the south stone corner. From there she faced north. The lane was not there, not as a lane, not as anything a person looking from a truck would have recognized as a path. But she was not looking the way a person looks from a truck. She was looking the way the deed read, which was word by word, and the deed said marked lane. And the question was, what mark meant in the context of ground that had been walked on by wheels and hooves for long enough that the earth had a memory of it. She found the memory. It was a shallow depression running north through the grass, not deep, maybe 6 inches lower than the surrounding ground, but continuous, unbroken, the way a line is continuous even when it is faint. The grass in the depression was slightly different from the grass beside it, shorter and more mixed with clover. The way grass is when the drainage runs toward it, or when it has been compacted over a long period and is growing back differently. Along the sides of the depression, at intervals that were roughly regular, there were cedar trees whose bases were older and more gnarled than the cedars in the fence row to the east, and they were angled, these cedars, slightly away from the center of the depression, the way trees angle when they grow in the edge of a space that has been used for something. She followed the depression north. She did it slowly, pausing every 10 or 15 yards to look ahead and to the sides, making sure the line she was following was continuous and not a coincidence of topography. Twice she lost it briefly in sections where the grass was thick, and both times she found it again by going to her knees and looking along the surface of the ground from a low angle, the way you look at a table to find a scratch that isn't visible from above. Two fence posts rotted down to stubs, the iron staples still showing rust orange in the wood where the wire had once run. A gap in the old stone wall larger than the natural fall of stones would have left the kind of gap that was shaped by a gate by years of swinging and standing open and the wear of animals passing through. She moved through the gap and continued north. The cedar was thicker here, the slope rising slightly to the right. She was breathing a little harder from the walking, and the sun had cleared the east ridge now and was coming in low and flat across the slope, which was useful because low light showed surface detail in a way that overhead light did not. She was looking for a walnut. She found one. It was not far from where the depression ended against the slope, and it looked like what she expected, a dead walnut. A stump, really black and rotted to a height of maybe 2 feet, surrounded by the small dark shells of long digested nuts that had worked themselves into the soil over the years. Young walnut sprouts grew in a loose ring around it, 3 or 4 of them knee-high, the seedlings that came up when a parent tree drops its last crop and dies. There was a low mound in the ground around it, the slow heave of soil that develops over years, around a large root mass as it breaks down. She stood in front of it and looked at it for a while. She took out the copy of the deed language and read it again. Thence north by the marked lane to the black walnut with water at the walnut. This was a black walnut. It was at the end of the marked lane. It was in the right direction from the south stone corner. By the logic of the description, this was the tree. She knelt down and pressed her hand into the soil at the base of the stump. It was dry. Not surface dry the way soil goes dry on top in June. Dry at depth. She pressed her fingers into the second knuckle and felt no change in moisture as she went deeper. The roots of the walnut, still visible as dark shapes in the soil, were hard and desiccated, the texture of something that had not been in wet ground for a long time. She sat back on her heels. She dug at the base for a while anyway, using the folding trowel she had put in her jacket pocket before she left the house. She was systematic about it, moving outward from the stump in a spiral, the way you probe a site when you are not sure exactly where the thing is. She worked for nearly an hour. The soil was consistent throughout, dry and stony, with no change in moisture or temperature as she moved from one spot to another. She sat back on her heels again and looked at the hole she had made. The sun was fully up now, and the day's heat was beginning to announce itself. She could hear the distant sound of a vehicle on the county road, and then the sound grew closer, and she looked up to see Dale Pickett's truck moving along the fence line on the eastern boundary, which was where the road ran before it curved away south. Dale was looking at her. He slowed the truck. "How many dead trees does it take to water a cow?" he called through the window. He did not wait for an answer. He drove on. She watched the dust settle behind his truck. She looked at the stump. The deed was not wrong. She was sure of that. She had read enough old documents to know the difference between careless language and deliberate language, and water at the walnut was deliberate. It was 3 words that did not belong in a boundary description unless they were true at the time they were written. But this was not the right walnut. She understood that now, sitting in the dirt beside a dry stump on the south face of the Farwell Ridge with Dale Pickett's dust still hanging in the air on the east fence line, in 21 days running, and the banker's number in her head. The deed had been written before this stump was old. There could have been 2 walnuts. There could have been a succession of them on the same spring line, the old one dying and a seedling taking its place 20 yards further along the slope. The depression had run north, and then she had stopped at this stump because it was there, because it fit, because the description seemed to be pointing at it. But she had stopped reading when she reached the part that looked right, and she had not read the rest. She got up. She brushed the dirt from her jeans. She put the trowel back in her pocket. She followed the slope of the ground. Not the depression, which had ended, but the shape of the land which ran northwest from where she was standing, and then bent slightly west, where the ridge began to flatten before it fell away to the lower hayfield. She was reading the topography now, rather than the physical remains of the lane reading it, the way her father had taught her to read ground, which was by watching where the water would go if it rained right now, which was by following the natural drainage lines, which was by letting the shape of the thing tell you what it was trying to say. The shape of the ground told her to go left. She went left. She found it 20 yards further along, tucked in a low place where the slope bent and the ground held a slight concavity, the kind of place that catches runoff and holds it for an extra day after the rain. Another stump, older than the first by the look of it, lower mostly buried under leaf litter and fallen material that had accumulated on the windward side of the low place over decades. A ring of young walnut sprouts, more of them than around the first stump, 8 or 10, some of them taller than she was. A scatter of old walnut shells worked deep into the soil by years of frost and pressure. A pair of flat stones lying in the ground in a pattern that was too regular to be natural fall. She cleared the leaf litter back with both hands. The soil beneath her hands was different. Not dramatically different. Not the kind of thing you would notice in passing or the kind of thing that would show on a survey. But different. Cooler under the surface than the soil she had been digging in an hour ago. Dark when she pressed it between her fingers. A darker color that meant moisture, that meant something moving through the soil at depth that was not moving through the soil on either side of this spot. The moss on the flat stones was a shade greener than the moss on the stones 20 feet away. She sat very still on her heels and looked at the ground around her. This was the one. She knew it the way she sometimes knew things at the courthouse before the document confirmed it, before the record bore it out. A certainty that was not quite rational and not quite irrational, the kind of knowing that comes from long practice at reading a particular language. She took the trowel from her pocket and she began to dig. An hour later, with a bucket, she had gone back to the truck to retrieve. She pressed the bottom of the bucket into the dampest spot she had found at the base of the second walnut stump in a shallow depression she had cleared of leaf silt and debris, and she set it there, and she looked at it for a moment, and then she walked back to the truck and drove home to make lunch. The next morning, there were 3 inches of water in the bottom of the bucket. She stood in the early light and looked at it. 3 inches. Not enough to water a chicken, the man at the store had said, when she mentioned it later that day, picking up wire and a tube of silicone she needed for a fence repair. He said it without cruelty, the way people in that county said most things, as plain fact as the kind of thing that did not require softening. He was right. 3 inches in a bucket was not what she needed. 3 inches in a bucket was a seep, a damp spot, a geological whisper of what a working spring looked like. What she needed was volume and flow, and the kind of documentation that Harlan Foss could hold in his hand and take seriously, and 3 inches in a bucket was none of those things. She drove home. She sat at the kitchen table with the legal pad. She had not yet told her Uncle Roy about the spring box. She had not told anyone about the spring box because she had found it only in the past 48 hours, buried in an estate inventory, filed at the county courthouse in the previous owner's estate, records a single line in a handwritten list of property improvements that ran to 3 pages. Spring box at the Walnut repaired 1941. Not a well, not a pump, a spring box. A stone-lined structure built into a hillside above a spring, the kind of thing men built in the century before anyone in Hill County owned a drill rig capable of going deep. The kind of thing that was built once and expected to last a generation before it needed attention, and that had apparently needed attention in 1941, and received it, and had then been forgotten. Because by 1941 there were newer ways to water cattle, and nobody had much reason to go back to the old ones. She had found the inventory by accident, looking for something else, pulling a folder from the wrong shelf and setting it aside to return, and then picking it up again because the name on the tab was an early owner of the Farwell land, and curiosity had gotten the better of her in the way it often did in the quiet of the courthouse file room. Spring box at the Walnut, repaired 1941. She had stared at that line for a long time. Then she had gone home and looked through the box of her father's notebooks, the personal ones, not the cattle records, the ones he had kept for 30 years as a kind of private accounting of the farm and the land and the things he observed about both. She had read pieces of them before. She had not read them all. She found the line she was looking for on page 47 of the third notebook. Walnut spring week when leaves choke stone mouth clear after first frost. Her father's handwriting. Neat and small the way he wrote, with the letters slanted slightly right and the periods placed firmly like a man who knew where his sentences ended. He had known. I had known there was a spring. He had known it ran weak in summer and cleared in late fall. He had known, and he had not told her, which meant either he had not known she would need to know it, or he had not known how close the farm was to losing its water documentation, or he had simply written it down the way he wrote everything down and trusted that she would find it when she needed to. She set the notebook on the table and looked at it. She thought about her father. He had been a quiet man. Not cold, not withholding, just quiet, in the way of men who believe that the most important information has a way of arriving when it is needed, and who have enough faith in the people around them to wait for that moment rather than rushing it. She thought about 3 inches of water in a bucket. She thought about 21 days. She thought about a stone box built into a hillside in 1941, 45 years ago, which was before she was born, which was before her father had taken over the farm, which was sitting somewhere on the south face of the upper ridge, under 45 years of leaf silt and walnut roots, and the slow accumulation of everything that goes uncleared when the person who knows where to look is no longer around to look. She thought about Amos Giddens. She had heard the name twice in the past year. Once from the man at the hardware store who mentioned Amos Giddens in the context of someone who used to know how water moved through this particular part of the county better than anyone. Once from her father years ago in passing, the way he sometimes mentioned people who had been important to the county before they became old and rare. Amos Giddens had built spring houses across 3 counties before anyone had a drill rig that could reliably reach the deep aquifer. He was 71 years old, and he had not taken a job in years, and there was something about the way people mentioned him carefully, the way they mentioned things they were not sure still existed, that told her she needed to find him before she lost any more days. She picked up the notebook. She read the line again. Walnut spring week when leaves choke stone mouth clear after first frost. Her father had written it down. He had written it down because men wrote what mattered. Outside, the evening was settling over the south pasture, and the cows were moving toward the lower fence again, and the mockingbird in the cedar was running through its catalog, and the light coming through the kitchen window was the particular amber of a hill country summer evening, the color of old glass, the color of things that had been here a long time. Lena Farwell sat at the table her father had sat at in the house her grandfather had built on the land the deed described, and she thought about what she was going to do next. The next morning early, before the heat came in and before the day had a chance to make decisions for her, she was going to go to the south face of the ridge, and she was going to dig past the 3 inches of water in the bucket, and she was going to follow the dampness wherever it led, and she was going to find the stone mouth of the Walnut Spring that her father had written about, and that the estate records had confirmed, and that the deed had pointed to for a century before anyone in that room at the bank had thought to read it carefully. She was going to find it. She folded the legal pad and set it beside the notebook. She turned off the kitchen light. She went to bed while it was still light enough to see, and she lay on her back looking at the ceiling in the way she had lain there as a child, listening to the farm settle around her. In the evening, the creak of the old house, the sound of cattle moving in the pasture, the mockingbird going through its last long sequence before dark. 20 days now. 19 by morning. She was not going to spend them worrying. She was going to spend them reading the ground. The next morning, before she went back to the slope, a vehicle she did not recognize turned in at the gate. It was a sedan, clean, the kind of car that had not been on a gravel road much by the look of the paint. It moved up the lane at the careful pace of a person who is unfamiliar with the surface, but does not want to appear so. The man who got out was 40 years old, more or less. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and dark slacks that had been appropriate for whatever he had been doing before he drove out here. He had the look of someone who understood that coming to a farm required some concession to the setting and had made the minimum concession. He said her name. He held out a card. His name was Wendell Grout. He said he understood she had inherited a piece of land that was under some pressure from the bank, and he wanted her to know that he had been watching properties in this part of the county for a number of years, and the Farwell land was the kind of ground he was interested in. He named a price. He said $14,500, which was more than the appraisal by a significant margin. And he said it the way people say a number they think will end a conversation clearly without warm-up, letting the number sit in the air between them. She said, "The farm's not for sale." He said, "I understand, but I want you to have the number in case things change before the bank situation resolves." He said it the way water runs around a stone patient in finding a direction. She noted that he was not arguing with her. He was leaving the number and leaving room for the conditions to do his arguing for him. She said, "I appreciate you coming out." He said, "If the number doesn't suit, it's worth a conversation. Things change. This is a hard piece of ground to carry alone." He said it without hostility. He was not wrong that the ground was hard and the alone was accurate, and she understood that he understood these things and was letting her understand that he understood them. He got back in the sedan. He drove back down the lane at the same careful pace, and she watched the dust rise and settle behind him. She thought about $14,500. She thought about the note, which was $6,800. The difference between them was $7,700, which was not nothing, which was in fact enough to do a significant number of necessary things on a farm that needed them. She thought about 19 cow-calf pairs moving in the south pasture. She thought about her father's handwriting in the notebook. Walnut spring week when leaves choke stone mouth clear after first frost. She put Wendell Grout's card on the kitchen counter and she went back outside. Amos Giddens lived on the county road 4 miles north of the Farwell place, in a house that sat back from the road far enough that you could miss it if you were driving with something else on your mind. The mailbox at the end of the drive was the kind that had been replaced so many times the post had layers of paint, like geological strata, white over black, over green over white again. The name was there stenciled in letters that had faded to just readable, which was all it needed to be for people who were looking. Lena turned in on a Thursday morning 9 days into her 21. She had spent the 2 days since finding the second walnut doing what she could without Amos Giddens, which was more than some people would have done, but less than she needed. She had gone back to the courthouse. She had gone back to the notebook. She had spent an afternoon at the county extension office, looking through their old files on spring development, which were not extensive but were there, tucked in a drawer at the back of the agricultural records room that the current extension agent apologized for, saying they kept meaning to organize it better. What she had found in total was enough to confirm what she suspected, but not enough to do what the bank required. The estate inventory that listed Springboks at the Walnut repaired 1941 was a legal document and could be copied. She had a certified copy of it now stamped by the courthouse clerk, folded in the same jacket pocket as the deed. But a certified copy of a 45-year-old estate record was not the same as a functioning spring. And a functioning spring was not the same as a documented water source. And a documented water source was what Harlan Foss needed to see before he could make any adjustment to the terms of the note. She needed to open the Springboks. She needed to open it correctly, which meant she needed someone who understood how they were built and what went wrong with them and how to address what had gone wrong without causing the kind of damage that was worse than the original problem. She needed Amos Giddens. She got out of the truck and walked up the drive. The place had the look of a property that had been worked by a serious person for a long time and was now being maintained by that same serious person at a reduced level of intensity. The barn was sound, but the pasture fence was more wire than post. The wire running between staples driven into trees where posts had given out and not been replaced. The garden on the south side of the house was well kept, but it was a small garden the size a man keeps when he is growing for himself and not for sale. A stack of split wood along the east side of the house ran from the ground to the eave, which was more wood than most people put up, the kind of surplus that came from a man who had spent his life in the habit of provision and had not unlearned the habit because the scale of things had changed. I was in the garden when she came around the side of the house. 71 years old, which was not how she had pictured him. And then she looked again and understood that it was exactly how she should have pictured him. He was lean in the way of men who have never stopped moving, and the moving had kept them from going to softness, the way men who slow down do. His hands were visible from across the garden, and they were the hands of someone who had done the kind of work that leaves its record in the knuckles and the calluses and the particular way a hand holds itself even when it is not holding anything. He looked up when she came through the gate. She told him her name and she told him whose daughter she was, because James Farwell was the kind of man who was known in the county and whose name opened conversations that might otherwise take longer. He nodded once when she said the name. She told him what she had come about. He did not respond right away. He finished what he was doing in the garden, which was staking a row of tomatoes with pieces of cedar branch cut to length, working methodically from one end of the row to the other. And then he set down the piece of twine he had been using, and he walked toward her, and he looked at her the way a man looks at someone he is deciding about. He said, "Your father was a man who kept his land right." She said, "I know." He said, "What makes you think there's a working spring under that walnut stump?" She told him about the deed language. She told him about the estate inventory from 1941. She told him about her father's notebook. She told him about the 3 inches of water in the bucket. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. She took the deed from her jacket pocket and held it out to him. He looked at it in her hand without taking it for a moment, and then he took it and held it at arm's length and read it without the glasses he was going to need in another year or two, and clearly knew it. He found the line. He read it. He read it again. Men didn't write water in a deed, he said, unless somebody had carried a bucket there. He handed the deed back to her. He said, "When do you want to go up?" She said, "Today if you're willing." He looked at the sky, which told him something she could not quite read. Then he went inside and she heard him moving around for a few minutes. And when he came out, he was wearing a canvas coat and carrying a canvas bag that clinked in a way that suggested tools. He said, "You drove, you drive." He rode with his arm resting on the window frame and his eyes moving over the country they passed through, the way the eyes of a person who has spent his whole life in a place move over it, reading it, noting changes, making comparisons to earlier versions. He did not make conversation, and she did not try to make it. She had the sense that this was a man who had decided what was worth saying by the time he was 30 years old and had not needed to revise the list much since. When she turned in at the Farwell gate, he looked at the fence line and at the condition of the lane, and she could not tell from his face what he thought of what he saw, which she supposed meant that what he saw was within the range of what he expected. She parked at the top of the lane and they walked from there. She led him the same way she had gone from the South Stone Corner north along the depression, through the gap in the old stone wall, up the south face to the first walnut stump, and past it northwest to the second one. I walked behind her at first and then beside her, and she found herself trying to see the ground the way he was seeing it, trying to understand what he was registering as he looked at the slope and the drainage and the growth patterns of the cedar and the young walnuts in their ring around the old stump. When they reached the second walnut, he stopped and looked at the ground she had been working for the past 2 days. The hole she had dug was still there, the soil turned back, the leaf silt she had cleared piled to one side. The pair of flat stones she had noted earlier were visible, the ones in a pattern too regular for natural fall. He crouched down and laid his palm flat on the stone she had not yet moved, the larger of the two. He held it there for a moment. He said, "Cooler." She said yes. He said, "Stays cool after rain or stays cool in dry weather." She said, "Dry weather. We've had dry weather for 3 weeks." He was quiet for a moment. He pressed the stone with the heel of his hand. He said, "That's a capstone." She waited. He said, "Not natural. Somebody shaped it." You can see the edgework on the southeast side if you know what to look for. That's dressed stone. She looked at the stone. She could see it now that he said it, the subtle regularity along the edge, the kind of surface that does not come from frost, heave, and gravity. He said, "What's under it?" She said, "I don't know. I haven't moved it yet." He looked at her. He said, "Why not?" She said, "Because I didn't know what I was moving it onto. I didn't want to damage something before I understood what it was." He was quiet again for a moment. He said, "Your father raised you right." He stood up. He opened the canvas bag and took out two tools she did not recognize, a flat pry bar of a kind she had not seen, and a handled probe that was different from a soil probe, longer and thinner with a shaped tip. He took out a small level as well, a short one, the kind used for masonry. He said, "You got a bucket." She had brought two nested together from the truck. He said, "Fill one from the creek on your way up. Not water for the spring. Water for us in case we're here a while." She went back down the slope to the lower hayfield where the creek ran, and she filled one bucket and brought it back up. By the time she returned, Amos had used the probe to sound the ground in a ring around the capstone, and he had the short level placed on the surface of the stone, and he was looking at the bubble. He said level from east to west, tilted about 2 degrees north to south. Settling, not placed that way. It was laid level. She set the water bucket down. He handed her the pry bar. He said, "Work it into the northeast corner, the side away from the high ground. Go slow. You want to lift, not lever. If you lever, you risk cracking the stone, and cracking the stone isn't what we want." She worked the flat end of the bar into the soil at the edge of the stone. The soil there was compacted but not hard, which surprised her, and then did not surprise her when she thought about what compaction near a spring looked like: soil that was not dry but not saturated soil, that had been evenly damp for a long time and had settled to a particular consistency. She worked the bar deeper and then applied upward pressure. The stone moved. Not much, an inch, maybe a little more. But it moved, and as it moved, there was a sound that was not the sound of stone on stone or stone on soil. A hollow sound, a contained sound, the sound of air that has been resting in a small enclosed space for a long time and has just been given a route out. She looked at Amos. I was looking at the gap she had opened at the edge of the stone. He pulled a small flashlight from his coat pocket and shone it into the gap, and she could see the light change as it went, in the way light changes when there is space for it to spread. He said, "Stone-lined. Two sides at least from what I can see. Move it the rest of the way." She did. The capstone was heavier than she had expected. It was roughly square, maybe 2 feet on a side and 4 inches thick, and it weighed enough that she had to use the pry bar from two angles and then get her hands under the edge and lean back with her full weight to get it clear. She got it far enough to the side that they could see what was underneath. What was underneath was a box, stone-lined on three sides that she could see, with the hillside itself making the fourth wall. The inside was maybe 18 inches square, too dark to see the bottom. Old mortar, gray-white and crumbling at the edges. Roots black and matted running down from the walls on the northwest side, which was the uphill side reaching into the interior of the box from above. Leaves, or what had once been leaves, now reduced to a dark paste that filled the lower half of the box's interior and covered whatever was at the bottom. And paste, slow and dark, was the movement of water. Not flowing, not running, moving the way water moves when it is finding its way through obstruction. The way a very slow thing finds the lowest point available to it over a long period. Amos crouched over the opening and looked into it for a while without speaking. He said, "Outlet pipe on the south face." Should be. It's how they were built. The inlet comes in from the hillside naturally. The outlet carries to wherever they were carrying it, stock tank or house or both. The paste you're looking at is 40 years of leaves and root material blocking the outlet. She said, "Is the inlet blocked too?" He said, "Inlet's never blocked. Water finds the inlet. That's not the problem." He pointed with one finger at the mass of black root material running down the northwest wall. Those roots came down from outside over time, through a gap in the mortar. They grew in because the moisture was there. They don't stop the water from coming in, they just hold the debris that the water brings with it. He looked at the paste at the bottom of the box. That's 40 years of walnut leaves and whatever else the runoff carried. It filled the box from the bottom up until it choked the outlet. The water backed up and found other ways out, which is how you got your seep. But the seep isn't the spring is still there. She said, can it be cleared? He said, that's what we're here to find out. He put on a pair of work gloves from his coat pocket and reached into the box. She did the same with the gloves she had brought. They worked side by side, clearing the root mass, first cutting the larger roots with a folding knife. Amos produced, pulling the cut sections free by hand, setting them to the side. The roots were soft, waterlogged, the consistency of something that had been growing in constant dampness for years. They came out in sections rather than all at once, and each section they removed let a little more light into the box and a little more movement into the water below. The morning was well along by then. The sun had moved past the cedars and was coming in at a high angle. She had stopped noticing the heat. When the roots were cleared, the debris remained. They worked through it by hand, scooping it into the empty bucket. And as they worked, the level of material in the box dropped, and the movement of the water below it became more apparent, and then they reached the bottom and found the outlet pipe. It was not a pipe in the modern sense. It was a channel cut through a flat stone at the bottom south side of the box, a rectangular channel 2 inches by 3, plugged solidly with compacted leaf paste, and a root that had grown through it from the outside and expanded until it had sealed the channel the way a cork seals a bottle. Amos looked at the root. He said, that's what you're dealing with. She said, can we get it out without breaking the stone? He said, depends on how deep the root goes outside. If it's a shallow root, we can cut it from both ends and work it clear. If it's a deep root, we have a conversation about whether the channel needs to be recut. He went outside and she stayed in the box, and she heard him working in the soil on the south face of the box, and after a few minutes he came back. Hi, said, shallow root. Cedar. Cedar roots are opportunists. They'll go where the moisture is, and they won't go deep if they don't have to. This one doesn't have to go deep because it found what it wanted at the surface. They cut it from both sides. They worked the cut sections free. The channel in the stone was clear except for the packed leaf material, and that came out with the probe carefully working from the inside, pushing rather than pulling, so they did not risk widening the channel by dragging debris against the edges. She was deep in the work, and she knew it in that particular state of concentration where the hands know what they are doing without much input from the thinking part of the mind, where the problem in front of you is the whole world and everything outside it has receded to a kind of background hum. She did not think about the bank. She did not think about the number 21, which was now down to 11. She thought about the channel in the stone and the material in the channel and the way the water was moving now that the upper part of the box was clear, moving more visibly, gathering at the bottom, the way water gathers when it has found a direction. The channel cleared. The water found it immediately. Not a rush, not a surge, a quickening. The movement in the bottom of the box became directional, became a flow rather than a seep, slow and dark, running toward the outlet channel and through it and out the other side, into the ground below. Amos sat back on his heels and watched it. He said, that's your spring. She looked at the water moving through the channel. She said, how much will it run? He said, not what you think today. It needs time to establish. The outlet's been blocked for 40 years. The water's been moving sideways, finding other routes, spreading out. When you give it back its route, it needs time to concentrate back to where it belongs. She said, how much time? He said, days, not weeks. The water's there. It's not a question of the water's been there the whole time. It's a question of whether the water remembers where it's supposed to go. She looked at the channel. The flow was steady, thin, a quarter-inch deep, and moving without hesitation. She said, we need to clear the outlet line down to the stock tank, if there's an original pipe. He said, there will be. They didn't build a box without a delivery line. You'll find it if you follow the ground. He looked at the slope below them, reading it. South then southeast. The tank would have been at the low spot. Where's your current water tank? She said, bottom of the south pasture. Corner post of the east fence. He said, then the line is between here and there. It'll be clay tile mostly likely or field stone in a channel. Either way, it's under the surface. You'll find it by following the slope and probing. She looked at the distance between where they were sitting in the bottom of the south pasture, a quarter-mile roughly, through brush and rocky slope and old cedar growth. She said, "We'll need to lay new line." He said most of it. Clay tile doesn't last 40 years in this kind of ground. You'll find sections maybe, you replace what's gone and clean what's there and test it. He looked at the water moving through the outlet channel, and then he looked at her. He said, "The water is already there. It has been there the whole time. You're not bringing water to this hill. You're making a path for what's already in it." She looked at the outlet, the thin, dark flow steady and certain moving south. She said, "My father knew. He wrote it in his notebook." Amos said, "I know he did. Men who kept this land right always knew what was in it." They spent the rest of the afternoon probing the slope below the springboks, following the outlet line south, sounding for the clay tile, in sections that were intact, in finding in a few places sections that were still whole and still aligned, and in other places the collapsed remnant of what had once been there. Amos marked the broken sections with small cedar stakes from his bag. She walked behind him and noted the distances in the small notebook she had started keeping in her jacket pocket. By 4 o'clock, they had mapped the route from the springboks to within 30 yards of the stock tank at the bottom of the south pasture. Amos said 3 days' work. 2 people. New poly pipe where the old tile's gone. You'll want to box the intake at the springboks properly before you lay the line. Set a screen over the inlet so you don't get this again. And you want to set a new capstone, something you can lift so you can get in and clean it every few years. She said, "What will that cost?" He said, "Materials. The work I'll do." She said, "I want to pay you for your time." He said, "I'll take a cord of wood in the fall when you're splitting." She said, "That's not enough." He said, "That's what I want." He looked at her with the particular directness of an old man who has decided what he needs and does not need to be argued with about it. She said, "All right." They walked back down the slope together in the late afternoon. The cows were moving in the south pasture below them, and she watched them moving and thought about the water that was at this moment running through the cleared outlet channel of a stone box built into a hillside in 1941, running thin and steady and finding its way south. There was a vehicle parked in her lane when she came around the house. Wendell Grout's sedan, the same clean paint. He was standing beside it the way he had stood the first time, with a patient quality that suggested he was accustomed to waiting. He said her name. He looked at her and at Amos Giddens, who was walking across the yard to his truck, and she could see him register something from that observation. He said, "I wanted to follow up on my visit earlier this week." She said, "I haven't changed my mind." He said, "I understand." He paused. "I've raised the number. 15,200 if you want to sign before the end of the week." He named it the way he had named the first number, cleanly and without warm-up. But this time he named it knowing that the number he was raising from was already on the table, which told her something about how seriously he was watching the calendar. She said, "I appreciate the offer. The farm's not for sale." He looked at Amos, who had gotten into his truck and was sitting there with the patience of a man who has seen versions of this conversation before. Wendell Grout looked back at Lena. He said, 5 days is a short time to be certain about things." She said, "I know what's on the ridge. I know what it will carry. I know what the deed says." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I hope that's true." He got back in his sedan. He drove down the lane at the same careful pace and turned onto the county road and was gone. Amos had rolled down his window. He said he knew about the bank before he came the first time. "He knows about the clock." She said, "I know." He said, "Men like that are patient up to a point. Past that point, they're in a hurry." She said, "I have 5 days." He said, "You have what we're going to do in 3. He drove home. She went inside. Roy Farwell was at the kitchen table when she got there. Her uncle had a key to the house that her father had given him years ago, and he used it with the irregular frequency of a man who is trying to be helpful without being intrusive, showing up when he thought something needed checking on. He was a good man, and he meant well by most of what he did, and she had loved him her whole life without ever quite being able to predict him. There was coffee on the stove that he had made, and he had 2 cups out, and he filled them when she came in. She sat down. He sat down. He said somebody called the house earlier, left a name, Wendell Grout, said he'd stop by. She said he came twice. He raised his offer. Roy said, "What's the number now?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "That covers the note with room left." She said, "I know." He said, "Lena." He looked at his coffee. He said, "I need you to be straight with me about what you're trying to do up there on the ridge." She said, "I'm trying to open a spring box that somebody built in 1941, and that's been plugged since before I was born." He said, "You found something." She said, "I found the box this morning. The outlet was blocked. Amos Giddens was with me. We cleared it. The water's moving." Roy looked at her. She said, "It's moving slow. It needs a few days to establish. We need to clear the outlet line from the box to the stock tank, lay new pipe where the old tiles failed. 3 days of work, maybe 4," he said, "and if it runs," she said, "if it runs with enough volume to document the appraisal changes. If the appraisal changes, the note terms change. And if the note terms change, I have time to get the herd back to where it should be." He said, "And if it doesn't run," she said, "then I have Wendell Grout's number." Roy put both hands around his coffee cup. He was looking at the table between them. He said, "I don't want to see you lose this place. I need you to know that first." She said, "I know that." He said, "But I also need you to know that $15,200 in your hand is a different thing than a promise of water and a hill on a piece of ground that a bank appraiser already said can't carry cattle." She said the appraiser didn't read the deed. Roy said the appraiser read the water records. She said the water records don't have what the deed has. He looked at her. She said, "Daddy knew about this spring, Roy. He wrote it in his notebook. He knew it was there, and he knew it was weak in summer, and he knew why, and he just didn't have time to do anything about it before he got sick." Roy was quiet. She said he wrote what mattered. He always wrote what mattered. She reached into her jacket pocket and she set the notebook on the table between them. Not open, just there, his brother's handwriting on the cover. Roy looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then he said, "You've got 5 days." She said, "I've got enough." I didn't look convinced, but he stopped arguing, which was a different thing, and he finished his coffee and he talked with her for a while about other things. The condition of the upper pasture fence and the hayfield and a heifer that had been off her feed for 2 days. The routine concerns of a farm in summer that were still there regardless of everything else. He stood up to go and he paused at the door. He said, "Let me know if you need another set of hands on that slope." She said, "I'll let you know." He left. She sat at the table after he was gone, and she opened her father's notebook to the page she had read so many times. It had started to feel like a page from a book she had owned her whole life, and she read the line again. "Walnut spring week when leaves choke stone mouth clear after first frost. Clear after first frost." She was not going to wait for first frost. She was going to clear it herself in the middle of the driest summer in a decade, with 5 days left on a banker's deadline and a man named Wendell Grout's phone number on a card on her kitchen counter. She was going to clear it because the water was already there. It just needed a path. She went to bed that night with the plan for the next morning already built in her head, the layout of the pipe run, the sequence of the work, the tools they would need from the equipment shed. She lay in the dark and heard the mockingbird and heard the cattle moving in the south pasture and did not think about Wendell Grout or Harlan Foss or the number 6,800. She thought about a stone box built into a hillside in 1941, built by a man she had never met and whose name she did not know, built the way things were built, then to last, to serve, to do the one thing it was built to do for as long as the materials held. 45 years. The materials had held. The water had held. Only the path had gone wrong, and a path was a thing that could be restored by people who were willing to do the work. She was willing to do the work. She closed her eyes. She slept better than she had in 3 weeks. The pipe work started before the sun cleared the east ridge. Amos arrived at first light with his canvas bag and a coil of half-inch poly pipe strapped to the bed of his truck. the kind of pipe that had replaced clay tile in the county over the past decade, and that Amos had opinions about, some favorable and some not, which he expressed in the selective way of a man who has learned that what you say about new materials reflects on your understanding of old ones. He said it'll carry the water. It won't last what the tile lasted, but it'll carry the water. She had the tools laid out on the tailgate: two spades, a hand tamper, the probe, wire cutters for the brush. A level she had found in her father's equipment shed, wooden handled, older than she was. They went up the slope together in the early light, through the dew-heavy grass of the south pasture, past the cedar line, up to where the stakes Amos had driven the previous afternoon still stood in a crooked line marking the route of the old delivery line from the spring box to the stock tank below. The work was straightforward in the way that hard physical work is straightforward. You did the next thing. You did not think past the next thing until the next thing was finished. You moved along the line of stakes, digging a trench where the old tile was gone, and the ground showed no evidence of having been disturbed in decades, cleaning out and relaying where the old tile was intact, in a line probing ahead before you dug to understand what you were getting into. Amos directed and she executed, which was not a dynamic she was unfamiliar with. She had grown up watching her father work with older men in this county, watching him take their direction without argument on questions where their knowledge exceeded his. And she understood that there was no diminishment in it, that taking correct direction from a person who knows more than you on a specific question was its own form of intelligence. The ground was harder than she had expected in some sections, and softer in others, the way ground is when you are following old water drainage, the soil character changing depending on how the water had moved through it over the years. Where the old clay tile had held and the water had run through it cleanly, the surrounding soil was consistent, the kind of soil that has not been disturbed. Where the tile had failed and the water had found other routes, the soil was layered differently, darker in bands where the moisture had concentrated, lighter where it had not. And in two places there were sections of subsidence where the ground had settled as the water below it had shifted. By mid-morning they were halfway down the slope. By the time the sun had moved to noon position and the heat was fully on them, they had reached the 30-yard mark where Amos had stopped the previous day, and from there the final run to the stock tank was a matter of bringing the line out of the ground and over the surface, which was faster work. She was moving the last section of new pipe into position when Amos stopped what he was doing and looked at the spring box. He said, "Go up and look." She climbed the slope back to the spring box and she looked into the open box. The water was not moving the way it had been moving the previous afternoon, thin and cautious, finding its direction. The water was moving with purpose. It was moving the way a thing moves when it has been given back the route it was built to travel and has remembered how to travel it. She stood over the box and watched it for a moment. Then she came back down the slope. She said, "It's running." He said, "I know. You can hear it in the pipe at the upper connection." He pointed at the section of poly pipe that ran from the spring box down to where they were standing. "You can hear it in there if you put your hand on it." She put her hand on the pipe. She could feel it. Not a vibration exactly, a movement. The pipe was doing what the pipe was built to do. They connected the final section to the inlet of the stock tank and they stood back. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the water came out the end of the pipe and ran into the tank with a sound that was ordinary and entirely extraordinary. At the same time, the sound of water going where it was supposed to go. The sound that every piece of work they had done for the past 3 days had been aimed at producing. Amos looked at the water running into the tank. He said, "Give it 2 days to run clear. There'll be color in it from the box organic material from the clearance. Clear water in 2 days, then you have your documentation." She said, "How much will it run?" He said, "More than enough. The inlet at the box is a serious seam. I've seen smaller springs carry 60 head through a dry summer. This will carry your 19. She said, "How do I know the bank will accept it?" He said, "The bank accepts documented water. That's all they need." Documented means measured and recorded and witnessed by someone they believe. You get an extension agent out here to measure and record. You bring Harlan Foss himself out here if you can. You let the water do the talking because the water is more convincing than any conversation you will ever have in that office. She looked at the water running into the tank. She said, I want to thank you. He said, you found it. I helped you clear it. That's not the same as me giving you something. She said, it's the same to me. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the tank and the slope above them and the spring box at the top of the line, invisible from where they were standing, tucked into the hillside under its temporary cover. He said, your father knew this water was here. She said, yes. He said, he just didn't have time. She said, no. He said, some things skip a generation. They sit and wait for the next one to come along with the time and the inclination. She said he wrote it in his notebook. He wrote what mattered. Amos looked at her. He said, that's right. He wrote what mattered. He picked up his canvas bag. He said, I'll come back in 2 days and we'll measure the flow together. You want a witness when you measure, and I'll be your witness. After that, you call the extension office. She said, I'll have the wood ready for you in October. He said, I know you will. He walked down the pasture to his truck the way he walked everywhere, at a pace that was not slow so much as deliberate, the pace of a man who has understood for a long time that the important work is the work in front of you, and the work in front of you does not require hurrying. She stood at the stock tank until his truck disappeared down the county road. Then she turned and looked at the cattle. They were at the far end of the pasture in the shade of the cedar line, the way they always were, in the middle of a hot afternoon. They did not know what had happened in the past 3 days. They did not know about deeds or spring boxes or the difference between a documented water source and an undocumented one. They knew the pasture and the shade and the pattern of the days on this piece of ground, and in 2 days they were going to find the stock tank running, and they were going to drink from it and walk away without ceremony, which was the only ceremony that actually mattered. She went inside and she called the county extension office and made an appointment for the following Friday. Then she sat at the kitchen table with the legal pad and she did the numbers. Materials for the pipe work ran to $430, which was what the hardware store had charged for the poly pipe and the fittings and the screen she had set over the inlet and the mortar she had used to reset the capstone with a handle built in so it could be lifted for cleaning. Labor was Amos Giddens, for which the payment was 1 cord of wood in October, which she valued at what she would have paid for a cord of split oak, which was currently running $120 delivered. She had spent $40 on tools she did not already own, most of them small. The total she wrote at the bottom of the column was $490. She looked at the number. She added in her time, which she did not count as a cash expense but wrote down anyway because it was real. 12 days of hours. She did not try to assign a dollar value to it. She wrote the days and the approximate hours per day and left the column blank at the bottom. $490. She looked at the number for a while. Then she turned the page and wrote the comparison. New drilled well, $9,650. Water hauling for a 60-day dry stretch, $2,992. Documented spring restoration, $490. She looked at the 3 numbers. She wrote another number below them. The appraised value of the farm with no documented water, $14,800. She had gotten that number from the appraisal report in Harlan Foss's office. She wrote beside it in parentheses the number Wendell Grout had offered her, $15,200, and she understood from the proximity of those 2 numbers that Wendell Grout had done his own appraisal and had offered her something just above it, just enough to seem generous, which was the kind of precision that told you how seriously he was watching. Below both of those numbers, she wrote a range she had gotten from the extension office that morning when she called a rough figure for what documented spring ground in this part of the county was carrying. The range was $24,000 to $29,000. Lena looked at the number 14,800 and the number 26,000 and thought about the distance between them, which was the distance between ground with no water and ground with water measured in dollars. The distance was the spring. The spring had been there the whole time. 2 days later, as Amos had said, the water ran clear. She brought 2 mason jars to the spring box and filled them both and held them up to the morning light. And the water in the jars was the color of well water, which is to say no particular color, which is to say the color of something that is what it is supposed to be. Amos measured the flow at the outlet pipe with a method she had not seen before. Simple and accurate, a bucket and a watch and arithmetic. The calculation produced a number that he wrote in his notebook and repeated to her, a flow sufficient to water her current herd through a 90-day dry period at standard consumption rates with margin. She wrote the same number in her notebook. She called the county extension agent. The agent came out on Friday morning. His name was Eldon Marsh, and he was 38 years old, and he had a clipboard and a form and a measuring device of his own, a different method than Amos's, but arriving at a number within 10% of Amos's number, which was close enough for a form. He wrote what he measured on the form. He noted the origin of the spring described as hillside emergence fed by upland infiltration. He noted the outlet arrangement described as stone-lined collection box, circa mid-20th century restored with gravity-fed delivery line to stock tank. He noted the estimated daily flow. He signed the form and handed her the top copy and kept the carbon. He said, "You'll want to get this to the bank pretty quick. They'll want their own assessment before they'll act on it, but this gets you in the door." She said, "I know." He said, "How'd you know it was there?" She said, "It was in the deed." He looked at her. She said 3 words, "Water at the Walnut." It was in the deed from the original patent. He looked at the hillside where the spring box was invisible from where they were standing. He said, "People miss that kind of thing." She said, "People don't always read the whole deed." He said, "I suppose they don't." He drove away. She drove to the bank the same afternoon. She set the extension agent's form on Harlan Foss's desk, the same way she had set the deed on it 12 days before, smoothing the edges before she let go. He read it without the glasses, and she watched his face, and his face did not give her much because Harlan Foss was a man who had learned not to give his face away at desks, which was one of the more useful things a banker could learn. He said, "This is a county extension assessment." She said, "Yes." He said, "We'll need an independent confirmation before we can adjust the appraisal." She said, "I know. How long for the independent confirmation?" He said, "Week to 10 days, assuming the assessor is available." She said, "I have 5 days left on the deadline." He looked at the form. He said, "I can put a hold on the proceedings while the assessment is pending." A professional assessment of a documented spring source is a material change to the appraisal basis. That gives me justification for the hold. She said, "How long is the hold?" He said, 30 days. Assessment should be done in less than 2 weeks. If it confirms the flow rate, we can renegotiate the note terms from there. She said, "Thank you." He said, "Don't thank me. The water did the work." He said it with a directness that surprised her slightly, and she understood from it that Harlan Foss was in fact not an unkind man, only a precise one. And precision sometimes arrived at the same place as kindness when the underlying facts were on your side. She drove home through the long light of a late afternoon in July. The road ran through the same country it had always run through, and she looked at it the way she looked at it when something was different inside her rather than outside, which was with a quality of attention that had more room in it than usual, the way you see things when the pressure that has been sitting on your looking has been lifted. August came in the way. August comes to hill country, which is without apology and without relief. The heat settled over the county like something with weight to it pressing down on the mornings, so they were warm before the sun was fully up, building through the day to an intensity that drove people and animals alike to the shade by early afternoon. It had not rained in 31 days. The creek at the bottom of the valley had gone from low and clear to low and slower, still running, but reduced to a threading motion between the stones, the way a creek looks when the water table below it is dropping. The hay field on the picket place, east of the Farwell boundary, had gone brown at the edges. Dale Pickett's pond, which she could see from the upper pasture fence line on a clear day, had dropped its level enough that the ring of pale mud at the waterline was visible at a distance. The Farwell stock tank ran. It ran with the consistency of something that had been running for a long time and expected to keep running, which was because it was and because it did. Each morning she went out before the heat came in, and she looked at the tank, and she looked at the cattle, and she noted what she needed to note in the pocket notebook she had taken to carrying. And each morning the numbers were the same flow rate, the same level in the tank, the same cattle making their unhurried way to the water, and drinking in the unhurried manner of animals who have found what they came for and have no reason to hurry about it. On a Thursday morning in the third week of August, she heard a vehicle on the county road that slowed in a particular way, the way a vehicle slows when the driver is looking at something rather than going somewhere. She was at the upper fence line checking a post that had been loose since spring, and she looked up when the slowing registered. Harlan Foss's car. He had not called ahead. He had not asked permission. He had driven out the way men in this county sometimes drove when they needed to see a thing for themselves, and had learned over long experience that the seeing was the only thing that settled certain questions definitively. She watched him park on the shoulder of the county road. She watched him get out and look at the south pasture. The cattle were at the lower end moving toward the stock tank with the casual morning purpose of animals that knew where the water was and expected it to be there. She watched Harlan Foss watch them move, and she watched him watch the stock tank, and she watched him look at the slope above the tank where the spring box was tucked into the hillside under its new capstone. He did not come in. He stood at the road for a few minutes with his hands in his pockets, and he looked at the farm. She walked down the slope toward the fence line. He saw her coming. He did not move toward her or away. He waited. She reached the fence. He said that from the deed. She said from the walnut. He looked at the stock tank. He looked at the cattle moving toward it. He looked at the slope. He said, I've been in this business a long time. She did not say anything. He said, I've seen a lot of land. I've seen men lose land they didn't need to lose because they didn't read what they had. He looked at her. He said, you read it. She said, I read it the way my father taught me to read things, from the beginning, not skipping anything. He was quiet for a moment. He said, the independent assessment came in yesterday. She said, and? He said it confirmed the flow rate within acceptable variance. He paused. The note terms will be restructured at the next rate on documented water ground. I wanted to tell you in person. She said, I appreciate that. He looked at the farm one more time. He said, your father was a good man who kept hard ground. She said, yes. He said, so are you as far as I can tell. He got back in his car. He drove down the county road toward town, and she stood at the fence line and watched him go. And then she turned and looked at the cattle who were at the stock tank now and drinking in the unhurried manner of animals who have found what they came for and have no reason to hurry about it. Later that afternoon, Dale Pickett's truck came along the east fence line, which was the road he drove when he was going somewhere, not the road he drove when he was coming to see her. He slowed at the section of fence that ran between her upper pasture and the county road, and she was near enough that she could see his window come down. She walked to the fence. I was looking at the slope above the stock tank. He had been looking at it for a while by the set of his eyes in the way of a man who has been working out a question before he stopped. He said, that water's running from the hill. She said, yes. He said, middle of August, dry as it's been. She said, yes. He was quiet for a moment. He said, I used to think that was just where the old tree fell. He nodded at the area above the spring box where the ring of young walnuts was growing. Thought it was just a stump and some sprouts. She said it was where men stopped to water. He looked at her. She said the deed says it. Water at the walnut. The men who wrote deeds in that century didn't write water unless somebody had carried a bucket there. He looked at the slope. He looked at the young walnuts. He said there's a depression on my east boundary. Old one. My father used to say there was a seep there before his time. She looked at him. He said, I never thought much about it. She said, do you have your original deed? He said, somewhere. Box in the attic, I expect. My father's papers. She said, read it from the beginning. Don't skip anything. Read every word the way they meant it when they wrote it. He looked at the stock tank. He looked at the cattle that were moving away from it, now satisfied walking back into the pasture. He said, how'd you learn to read it that way? She said, I used to work at the courthouse. And my father, he said, your father, she said, he wrote what mattered. He always wrote what mattered. Dale Pickett put his truck in gear. His wife Vera was in the passenger seat. She had not said anything through the exchange, but she had been watching the stock tank with a kind of attention that told Lena she had already arrived at whatever conclusion her husband was still working toward. Vera said through the window as the truck began to move, "That's good water." She said it the way a woman says something she has been thinking about for more than a minute and has decided is simply true. Lena said yes, it is. The truck moved on down the road. The following week, the county property record was updated. Where the appraisal had read no well of record, the record now read restored spring box, hillside emergence, gravity-fed delivery, documented flow. Those words went into the file where no water had been for as long as the file had existed. The clerk who entered them did so without ceremony, the way clerks enter things that are simply true and need to be in the record, and the record closed and went back on the shelf and became part of what the county knew about the Farwell place. Wendell Grout did not call again. She did not hear from him. She did not expect to. The price he had been watching for was the price that came with undocumented ground under pressure. And that price was gone, now replaced by the price of documented spring ground, with a herd carrying its weight on a note at terms that gave the land room to breathe. The property he had been watching was still there. It was worth something different now. She went into the house and she made a pot of coffee, and she sat at the kitchen table with her father's notebook open to the page. She had read more times than she had read any other page in her life. Walnut spring week when leaves choke stone mouth clear after first frost. She read it. She read it the way she always read it from the beginning, not skipping anything. Then she turned the page. She had not read past this page before. She had found what she was looking for, and she had not needed to go further. And the habit of a courthouse file clerk is to stop reading when you have found what you came for and close the folder and put it back. But she turned the page. Her father's handwriting continued. Notes about the South Hay Field. Notes about a fence repair on the north boundary. A record of a calving in March that she recognized as being from 3 years before he got sick. A calf she remembered because it had been breech, and they had worked for 2 hours in the coal barn to turn it and get it out. And her father had named it Patience, which was not his usual way with cattle, but which the occasion had seemed to require. She read through several pages. Near the end of the notebook, near the last pages he had filled before the handwriting began to change with the changes the illness made in him, she found another line that stopped her. It said, "The deed knows what the ground remembers. Read the deed the way it was written." Somebody knew something when they wrote it down. She sat with the notebook in her hands. She thought about men who wrote what mattered. She thought about a man who wrote legal descriptions in a language that carried real knowledge, who wrote the word water next to a tree because the water was real and the tree was its sign, and the knowledge was worth recording for whoever came next. She thought about the kind of patience required to write a thing down and fold it and put it where the right person could find it. Her father had known. He had known about the spring, and he had known about the deed, and he had written what he knew in the language available to him, in the notebooks he kept on the shelf above the kitchen desk, and he had trusted that the notebooks would be read by the person who needed to read them, and they had been. She closed the notebook. She set it on the table. Outside, the August evening was settling over the south pasture in the particular way it settled in that country, the light going amber and then lower the shadows from the cedar line reaching across the grass, the cattle moving in their slow, deliberate patterns toward the lower end of the pasture where the evening was cooler. The stock tank was full. She had documented water on 74 acres of hill country ground that 3 weeks ago had been appraised as carrying none. The note would be restructured. The herd would stay. The farm would carry what it was always capable of carrying, which was more than the appraisal had said, which was what the deed had said all along. She got up from the table. She went outside. She stood in the yard in the last of the evening light, and she looked at the south pasture, and she looked at the slope where the spring box was, and she looked at the stock tank still and full and doing the one thing it was built to do. She thought about the cost. $490 in materials, 1 cord of wood in October, 12 days of her own time. The work of an old man who had learned water before anyone in the county had a drill rig that went deep. She thought about $9,650. She thought about what the difference between those numbers meant and what it had required to find the difference, and where the difference had come from. The difference had come from 3 words in an old deed. The difference had come from a man who wrote what mattered. She looked at the slope above the stock tank for a long time in the failing light. She thought about her father standing in this yard looking at this same slope, knowing what she now knew, writing it in his notebook in the careful slanted hand she had known her whole life. He had known. He just had not had time. She had had 21 days. It had been enough. She went back inside. She closed the door against the evening. She turned on the kitchen light and she made something to eat standing at the stove in her father's kitchen, in the house her grandfather had built on the land the deed described. She ate at the kitchen table with the notebook open beside her plate, not reading it, just having it there. The way you have a thing near you when it matters to you, and you do not yet have a better reason to account for why. When she was finished, she washed her plate and dried it and put it away. She opened the drawer where her father had kept a box of blank index cards, and she took one out and she wrote on it with a pen from the cup by the telephone. She wrote water at the Walnut. She wrote below it Walnut spring week when leaves choke stone mouth clear after first frost. She wrote below that men wrote what mattered. She put the card in the back cover of the notebook between the last page and the cover where it would stay flat and not crease. She put the notebook on the shelf above the kitchen desk, where it had always been, where it belonged. Outside in the August dark, the cattle moved in the south pasture and the stock tank held what it had been holding for 10 days without interruption. And somewhere on the south face of the upper ridge in a stone box, built by a man she had never met in a year before her father was born, the water came in from the hill and found its channel and ran south the way it had been running for longer than any of them had been there to notice it. It ran through the pipe they had laid. It ran into the tank. It ran all night. That was the whole story. That was what water at the Walnut meant.